Well, we're starting a series this morning called Survival Skills for Life's Greatest Battles. And let me tell you, there are sermon series and there are sermon series. And by that I mean there are some sermon series where it's 3 or 4 sermons that are sermons in and of themselves that are linked together by common theme. And then there are sermon series where it really is just one sermon broken into 3 different pieces. And that's what this sermon series is. And the reason I'm telling you this is to put a little bit of pressure on you to be here for chapter 2 and 3. We know that you can't be here sometimes, illness, or you got to travel or something. And that's the reason we have the podcast, and we have video podcasts now. People seem to enjoy that. But what I want you to know is that you're only going to get 1/3 of the message here today. It won't tell you how to survive life's greatest battles. It'll give you one of the 3 pieces of that. Today we're talking about be yourself because you're bigger than you think. Next week we'll talk about on the theme be prepared, and the final week it'll be trust in God. So this is a great story. Preachers, at least I change up a lot at the last, so I'm going to read a little bit more than what we've got up there on the PowerPoint in order to set the context on this. I'm going to start with Samuel 17 verse 31, really verse 32. David is a young man, as you know. He's gone to the battle. The Philistines and the Israelites are faced off against one another. Goliath, the great Philistine warrior, comes to the front. He says, we don't need to have a bloody battle with a lot of people. Let's just go one-on-one. I'll take on your greatest warrior, and whoever wins that will win the battle. And of course, nobody wants to go except for David. And David comes to Saul, the king, who's leading the army, and he says, let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant, meaning I, will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a bear or a lion came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And so he talks about his prior experiences in the wilderness, and we'll pick it up here. We'll just a little bit of repetition. David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. If it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaws, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine. And so Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. And Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. And then David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I'm not used to them. So David removed them. And then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag, in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine Goliath. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I don't know when I first heard this story read to me as a young child, but I do know that I heard it many, many times before I read it myself. I'm sure it was my mother or one of my grandmothers that first read it to me, probably heard it in a Sunday school class or in vacation Bible school. It's one of those great children's stories. I hope we're reading these wonderful Old Testament stories to our children and our grandchildren. And it's one of those stories that we gravitate to. We love it because it's about these wonderful, powerful, eternal themes. It's about the bully getting his upcomings, isn't it? It's about overcoming insurmountable odds. And perhaps more than anything else, it is about good triumphing over evil. And so it is an extraordinarily important story. As we grow older and we begin to look at this story as adults rather than children, we find that there are powerful insights in this story. We learn what it means to take on those huge challenges in life. Because they do occur, don't they? We all meet up with Goliath at one time or another. Goliath shows up in many forms. You've heard this list before. Sometimes Goliath appears before us in the form of unemployment, unexpected, or financial disaster, unexpected. Sometimes Goliath shows up as depression or mental illness. Sometimes Goliath shows up in the form of the destruction or breakup of an important relationship. Sometimes a kid who is on drugs or some other huge family issue. But what we know is that sooner or later, Goliath will show up. I'm always interested in the timing of things. I don't really know how to explain some kinds of timing. But earlier this week, a friend of mine called me. Not really a friend. She actually is more of an acquaintance than a friend. I've known her mostly on a professional basis, 2 or 3 dealings with her professionally. And she said, Reverend Underwood, I'd like to come up and visit with you if you don't mind, if you'd give me a few minutes. She said, we don't know each other very well, but I've admired you from a distance, and I'd like to get some feedback from you. And I said, of course. And she came up this past week. She met with me in my office. We sat together, and she said, I'm facing the biggest battle of my life. She said, in fact, I'm facing the battle for my life. And then she shared with me the diagnosis and the prognosis. Wasn't good news. Wasn't good news. Sooner or later, we meet up with Goliath, don't we? It isn't always a challenge that threatens to overwhelm us or to destroy us. Sometimes it is an opportunity. I think that's the way David saw this. His defeat of Goliath was really the pathway to becoming the king of Israel. So sometimes Goliath is a great opportunity. But what we know is that sooner or later we have the opportunity or the challenge of facing great odds in life. And so what I want us to do is turn to the pivotal passages here. There's 2 verses here that I think are extraordinary, and we're going to look at them again. Verses 38 and 39. Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. And then David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I'm not used to them. And so David removed them. I think this is one of the most extraordinary passages in all of the Bible, and one of those important insights we will ever receive from reading the Bible. David, you see, somehow understood that you are never more powerful than when you are simply being yourself, and you are never weaker than when you try to be someone else. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, we get that, don't we? When you read the story and you read how David went out there and defeated Goliath by throwing a stone, hitting him in the head, you understand that had David tried to go onto the field of battle wearing Saul's armor, trying to fight like Saul, he would have been defeated, he would have been killed. Somehow he had this extraordinary insight that you're never stronger than when you're being yourself, and you are never weaker than when you try to be someone else. It's an important word for us to hear, isn't it? Because the world tells us the opposite all of the time. All of the time. You remember that advertising campaign a few years ago? Huge advertising campaign. Everybody remembers this. The slogan was, just be like Mike. I think it was a Nike campaign, right? Just be like Mike. Be like Michael Jordan. And you heard it all over the place. But it was kind of absurd in a lot of ways. I mean, I love Michael Jordan. I think he was probably the greatest player in the history of the game, maybe the greatest player who will ever play the game. But I can't be like Mike. For one thing, I can't jump. I couldn't even jump when I was young. I can't jump now. Jacob may grow up. He may be a jumper. He might be like Mike. But I can't be like Mike. And yet there was this huge campaign saying, just be like Mike. And the world tells us this all of the time. These advertising campaigns that say, if you'll drive this kind of car, you'll be like this kind of actor or this kind of athlete. Or if you'll wear this kind of makeup, you'll be like this kind of famous person. We are constantly bombarded with the message that we are not good enough, that if we'll just do something like somebody else has done it, wear somebody else's armor, we will be good enough. And so this is what has happened in our contemporary society. All of our young teenage girls want to be like somebody else. They want to be like Brittany, or they want to be like Taylor. The youth choir was here at the 8:45 service this morning. I turned to them and I said, look, if you have to choose between Brittany and Taylor, for God's sake, choose Taylor. But the point is, you don't have to choose either one, because being yourself is better than being either of those. And our young men want to be like a particular athlete or a particular musician. The message of David, this extraordinary young man, understood it so clearly. If he wanted to be at his very strongest, at his very best, he just needed to be himself. Be himself. I think about the ways in which we can apply that in a practical way on an everyday basis. For instance, I think about relationships. How important it is to just simply be yourself in your relationships, because we're all tempted to be somebody else, aren't we? I'm 64 years old, and so I had to stretch a little bit for these memories, but I was 31 when I got married. And so I spent a decade in my 20s, dating various girls, and I started thinking about that. And I remember meeting a beautiful girl here and there, and reaching, you know what I mean? Wow, and trying to be somebody other than myself in order to impress. You guys remember doing this? And we all discovered that is the fastest way in the world to become the strikeout king, didn't we? What about our mature relationships? Something that I see all of the time, and it is such a mistake. When somebody tries so hard to be the person that they think the other person in their relationship wants them to be. You try to be what somebody else wants you to be, and it is the road to disaster. The road to disaster. I'm not saying that we don't grow as human beings, that we don't change as human beings. That's the reason we have therapy. Sometimes you need a little therapy so everybody can get on the same page, so everybody can be themselves. You're never better than when you're simply being yourself. I got to thinking about this in terms of the challenge of employment, interviews, that kind of thing. We have kind of an interesting system around here when we get ready to hire somebody. I don't know that it's any different from the way they do it at your work, but if we're making a major hire and I get involved, then I always assume that by the time we interview with teams, and I always assume that by the time somebody is interviewing with us, that we don't have to really worry about whether or not they're competent, that the resume is okay. So we have a team that will sit down with somebody in one of our final interviews, and I'll go in there, and for the most part, I'll just sit there and listen. And everybody else will go over the resume and the qualifications and all of that, talk about how the job is done and so forth. And I really just listen for two things. I listen to see whether this person will fit in terms of the values that we have in our church, a work ethic, whether they can be a team player, that kind of thing. And then even more important than that, in terms of making the decision, is I listen to see whether or not they are authentic. Whether the person that I'm seeing in front of me is who they really are, whether they can sit there and be comfortable in their own skin. It's the most important thing to me, and I think when we've made successful hires around here, that's the reason. I'll tell you a brief story, because we've hired some Davids around here. A number of years ago, many of you remember Todd Harris, who was our senior associate at one time. He came on our staff right at the time that we were moving from the old location on Glencliff to this location in 1997. And he played such an extraordinarily important and pivotal role in the growth of this church at the most important time. And we went from being a medium-sized church to a big church under Todd's leadership. And we had built the Christian Life Center, and we were hiring a major staff member, and Todd was in charge of that. And he came into my office one day. He said, "Don, I'm interviewing a young man in my office." And he said, "If you're not busy, I'd like for you to come in and meet this guy." He said, "He's not our candidate at all because he doesn't have anything that we're looking for. We're looking for experience. We're looking for major managerial skills. He's 21 years old. He just graduated from college. He's never had a full-time job. He has no experience in this field, and he has no demonstrable managerial skills. But I'd just like for you to meet him. I think you'll enjoy talking to him." And I said, "Okay, I'll come in there." So I went to Todd's office. I thought this would be pretty much a waste of time. I did. I went to Todd's office. I spent about 10 minutes talking with this young man. And after a while, I said, "Well, I need to get back to work." And I left Todd's office. I said, "Todd, will you come with me?" So he went back to my office, and I closed the door. He said, I know. I'm sorry. I wasted your time. He's way too young. He's just out of college. He has no managerial skills or experience at all." I said, "Todd, just go back in there and make that young man an offer, if you don't mind." That young man was Chris Jones, who many of you will remember as one of the most competent people we ever hired at this church. He was a young David. He was so impressive because he just knew how to be himself. You're at your very best, your very strongest when you're just yourself. You're never weaker than when you try to be someone else. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes here in closing talking about how it was that David came to believe in himself in that way. Because that's the question, isn't it? I mean, we get it, but how do you develop that kind of inner courage, backbone, self-confidence, if you will? Because you see, David had lots of competing voices in his life. If you turn back just one chapter to chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, you'll get this story that we've talked about so many times in this church. God comes to Samuel the prophet and he says, "Look, I need to find a successor to Saul the king, someone who will be the king of Israel. And I want you to go to Bethlehem to the house of Jesse, and one of his sons will be the successor to Saul, and you will know it when you meet him." And so Samuel makes the trip to Bethlehem. He finds the house of Jesse. He comes to Jesse. He says, "Jesse, I want you to bring all of your sons out here because one of them will be anointed as the king of Israel, the successor to Saul." And so Jesse calls his sons, and these 7 sons come out. And I mean, every one of them is tall, handsome, athletic, smart, good-looking. Most of them had degrees from Ivy League schools. Princeton, Yale, Harvard. 1 or 2 of them had been to one of the academies, played football. Brilliant boys. And Samuel starts with the oldest one. He looks at this young man, the oldest, and he says, "Surely this is the one." And God says, "Nope, not this one." And then he goes down the line one by one. The next to the oldest says, "Surely this is the one. This is the one." And he goes down until he's finished with all 7 boys. And God says, "Not any of these." Samuel's exasperated and he turns to Jesse. He says, "Look, God told me that one of your sons will be the king of Israel. Is this all of your sons?" And Jesse says, "Well, David, he's the youngest one. He's out there in the back pasture tending the sheep. It's like, he's the runt of the litter. He really doesn't count, the youngest. We've kept him out there. We won't embarrass anybody." Samuel says, "Go get him." And young David comes and stands in front of him, and God says, "This is the one. This is the one." What do you suppose it was like to be David? All these brilliant older brothers saying, don't bother with David. When you read the story this week, I hope that you will, you'll see that they were all jealous of him. They were at the battle. There was Saul and the rest of the army of Israel, and David shows up. They say, what are you doing here? You're just a kid. They were all jealous. And so David had all of these competing voices in his life. But if you read the story carefully and with great sensitivity, I think this is what you will discover. David talks about all of those years that he spent in the wilderness. All of those years that he spent in the wilderness. He says, I was out there with the lion and the wolf. And I discovered the presence of something much more powerful than I. Out in the wilderness, I discovered the presence and the power of God. And I discovered that God would always, always be with me. And I discovered that I'm a child of God. And that's good enough. That's good enough. Don't you suppose it was out there in the wilderness where David composed the lines to the Psalm 139? I was wondrously knitted together in the womb of my mother. Wondrously created by God. I know I'm a child of God. For 30 years, that has been a core message of Christ's church. And we proclaim it all the time. This baptism we did earlier with Jacob, how many times have you seen me carry a child down the aisle and say these words? Because this child is now and forever will be a child of God. And I know you think I'm saying that because of the kid. Look, the kid isn't old enough to know what I'm saying. I'm saying it for your sake. Because I want you to hear the message over and over again that you are and forever will be a child of God. David, out there in the wilderness, had such an extraordinary experience, not only with the power and presence, but also the love and grace of God, that he knew that he was okay. He knew that he was a child of God. He knew that you're always stronger when you're yourself. You're never weaker when you're someone else. I pray that you will go from this place and remember the remarkable good news that you are a child of God. And when you meet your Goliath, just be yourself. You're bigger than you thought.